Move to economy. We need these seats for more important passengers. These words, spoken by an Air France attendant to an African passenger, led to one of the most embarrassing diplomatic incidents in recent aviation history. The flight attendant and French CEO had no idea they were disrespecting the president of Burkina Faso, who was traveling incognito. When military vehicles surrounded the plane upon landing in Ouagadougou, their faces turned white with shock. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who don't need to announce their importance. What if the person you just spoke down to happened to be one of the most powerful leaders in Africa? This question became a shocking reality for a flight attendant and French CEO, who ended up making a critical error by disrespecting a seemingly ordinary passenger. President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso stands out among world leaders for his refreshingly humble approach to leadership. Unlike many heads of state who travel with massive security details, flashing lights, and motorcades, Traore often chooses to travel privately and humbly. No cameras, no loud announcements. This captain-turned-president represents a new generation of African leadership that prioritizes substance over show, preferring to connect with citizens on their level rather than floating above them in presidential privilege. On this particular day, Traore was returning from an important European diplomatic mission. Instead of arranging a private jet or government aircraft as most presidents would, he simply booked a business-class seat on a commercial Air France flight to Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. His choice reflected a consistent pattern in his leadership, experiencing the same conditions his citizens face when they travel internationally. Seated in the business-class cabin, there was nothing about Traore's appearance that signaled his importance. He wore simple, professional attire with no presidential pins or emblems. No security detail surrounded him. No special announcements were made when he boarded. To all observers, he appeared to be just another African businessman traveling home. His passport was diplomatic, but he presented it without fanfare, and the check-in agents processed him like any other passenger. This approach to travel wasn't merely personal preference. It served a strategic purpose in his governance style. By traveling incognito, Traore could directly observe how international carriers treated African passengers. The experience provided unfiltered insights no presidential report could capture: the subtle discrimination, the tone of interaction, the quality of service offered to his countrymen compared to European travelers. What made Traore particularly vulnerable on this flight was precisely his unassuming presence. Without the shields of protocol and presidential markings, he became just another African man in a business suit, an easy target for the discrimination that often goes unchallenged in international spaces. His calm demeanor and quiet confidence gave no indication of the authority he actually possessed. The context of this encounter runs much deeper than a simple airline incident. Burkina Faso's relationship with France carries the complex weight of colonial history. As a former French colony that gained independence in 1960, Burkina Faso has struggled to establish truly equal footing with its former ruler. French businesses maintain significant interest throughout West Africa, creating economic dynamics that often favor European profits over local development. These tensions had intensified in recent years. Many citizens of Burkina Faso viewed French commercial presence with growing skepticism, questioning whether these business relationships truly benefited local communities or simply extracted wealth from African resources. French CEOs frequently traveled between Paris and Ouagadougou, maintaining corporate interests that dated back to colonial arrangements. President Traore's leadership emerged from this historical context. As a military man who rose to political leadership, he understood both the strategic importance of international relationships and the necessity of protecting national dignity. His approach to diplomacy balanced pragmatic cooperation with unwavering defense of his nation's respect on the world stage. The Air France flight that day became an unexpected testing ground for these principles. Without realizing it, the airline staff and a privileged passenger were about to challenge the dignity of a head of state who traveled without announcing his importance. Traore's humble approach was about to expose attitudes that normally remain hidden behind polite diplomatic facades. What makes this story particularly revealing is how discrimination surfaces when people believe no important witnesses are present. The treatment reserved for ordinary Africans, the dismissive tones, the assumptions about their status, the expectation that they should yield to European priorities, all came into play because the flight crew had no idea who was actually sitting in seat 4C. As the crowded flight reached cruising altitude, passengers settled in for the journey to Burkina Faso. The business class cabin was full, creating logistical challenges for the crew. It was in this context of limited space and competing priorities that the incident began to unfold. But as the flight attendant approached his seat, no one could have predicted the chain of events about to unfold. Discrimination often reveals its ugly face when people think nobody important is watching. The privileged feel comfortable exercising their power over those they perceive as lesser when they believe there will be no consequences. This dynamic played out in full view aboard the Air France flight, where President Traore sat quietly in business class. About 2 hours into the flight, a commotion started several rows ahead. Claire, the senior flight attendant with over 15 years of experience at Air France, was speaking with an agitated passenger. This passenger wasn't just any traveler. He was Marcel Dupont, CEO of a major French mining corporation with significant operations throughout West Africa. Dupont was a regular on this route, flying between Paris and various African capitals where his company extracted valuable minerals. Dupont's body language told the whole story before anyone heard his words. He gestured dramatically at his seat, complained about the lack of space, and pointed to his expensive watch as if time itself should bend to his will. Claire nodded sympathetically, her practiced customer service smile masking whatever she actually thought about his complaints. "This arrangement is unacceptable," Dupont said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I need more room to work. Can't you find me another seat? Perhaps combine 2 places?" His tone carried the unmistakable weight of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it. Claire surveyed the full business class cabin, her eyes eventually landing on President Traore and another African businessman seated across from him. The flight attendant made her calculation quickly. These 2 passengers, in her estimation, were the most expendable in the premium cabin. Without consulting any other passengers, she approached Traore first. "Sir, we may need to move you to accommodate another passenger. Would you mind relocating to economy?" "We will compensate you," Claire said with a professional but cold tone. When Traore didn't immediately respond, her demeanor shifted. "You, sir, we need you to move to economy." Then came the words that would later make international headlines. "Move to economy. We need these seats for more important passengers." The cabin fell uncomfortably quiet as several passengers glanced up from their magazines and screens. President Traore maintained remarkable composure despite the clear insult. "I paid for this seat," he responded calmly. "On what basis are you asking me specifically to move?" His question was pointed but delivered without raising his voice. The African businessman across the aisle also received similar treatment. "Perhaps you could join your friend in economy," Claire suggested, making assumptions about their relationship simply because both men were black. "We have an important businessman who requires additional space." Other passengers in the cabin watched the scene unfold with visible discomfort. A few exchanged concerned glances, but no one intervened. One Belgian woman appeared about to say something, but then returned to her magazine. The social pressure to avoid conflict on an international flight kept potential allies silent. Claire's approach grew increasingly dismissive as Traore continued to calmly refuse. "This is a matter of priorities," she explained with thinly veiled condescension. "Surely you understand that some accommodations need to be made for our VIP passengers." The French CEO, rather than appearing embarrassed by the preferential treatment, seemed to expect it. He watched the exchange with impatient entitlement, occasionally making eye contact with Claire to express his frustration at the delay in resolving his complaint. His presence and silent approval emboldened the flight attendant's discriminatory behavior. What Claire didn't realize was that her actions revealed persistent colonial attitudes that still infected international business. By targeting the African passengers first, without considering any other travelers, she exposed unconscious biases about who deserved premium space and who was disposable. After trying unsuccessfully with Traore and his across-aisle neighbor, Claire moved down the cabin, approaching other black passengers with the same request. This pattern made it impossible to ignore the discriminatory nature of her actions. She bypassed several European travelers who could have been asked to move, focusing exclusively on African passengers. Why did Claire target President Traore? His unassuming presence made him appear to be an easy target. Without bodyguards, presidential insignia, or any outward signs of his importance, Traore looked to Claire like just another African businessman who could be pushed around to satisfy a more important French executive. The incident revealed how discrimination operates when people believe no important witnesses are present. The flight attendant felt comfortable prioritizing a demanding French businessman over African passengers precisely because she assumed no one with real power was watching. As the situation escalated, President Traore began to assert himself more firmly, though still without revealing his identity. "Madam," he said with calm authority that seemed to surprise Claire, "I believe your policy of selecting which passengers to displace should be transparent. Can you explain why you've only approached African passengers in this cabin?" The question hung in the air as other passengers looked up, suddenly more engaged in the unfolding conflict. The true revelation of power often happens at the most unexpected moments. President Traore, having faced the direct discrimination from the flight attendant, remained composed as he continued to question Claire's methods. "I notice you have only approached African passengers with your request. Is this the official Air France policy?" His words carried weight despite his calm tone. Several other passengers nodded in agreement, suddenly aware of the pattern. Claire's face tightened as she realized her actions were being scrutinized. "Sir, this is not about where you're from. We simply need to accommodate an important passenger." Her tone grew more defensive, revealing her discomfort at being called out. She glanced toward Dupont, seeking backup from the French CEO who had initiated the entire situation. Dupont, seeing the flight attendant struggling, stood up and inserted himself into the conversation. "Look, this isn't complicated. Some passengers are simply more valuable to the airline than others." He gestured toward his expensive suit and watch, implying his status. "My company books dozens of business class tickets every month. Surely you understand how business works?" His condescending smile revealed his assumption that money equaled importance. President Traore simply raised an eyebrow. "I understand business very well, monsieur. I also understand dignity." His response was quiet but firm. "Every passenger who purchased a ticket deserves the seat they paid for. Your frequent flyer status does not make you more human than anyone else on this aircraft." The French CEO scoffed. "Don't lecture me about business, my friend. I've been working in your country longer than you've probably had a passport." This patronizing statement hung in the air, heavy with colonial undertones. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension in the cabin growing thicker. Claire attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, if you won't cooperate, I'll need to report this incident." Her threat carried little weight, but she clearly expected it to intimidate Traore into compliance. When he remained unmoved, she turned and whispered something to Dupont, who nodded with a smug expression. As the flight continued, the conflict remained unresolved. Traore stayed in his seat. The other African businessman likewise refused to move, and the French CEO periodically shot annoyed glances in their direction. The cabin crew avoided Traore's section, except when absolutely necessary, creating an awkward atmosphere for the remainder of the flight. The captain's voice eventually came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Ouagadougou. As the plane began its approach, passengers packed away their belongings and prepared for landing. The conflict seemed to fade into the background as the routine of arrival took over. When the aircraft dipped below the clouds, the first unusual signs appeared. Through the windows on the right side of the plane, multiple military vehicles were visible near the terminal. This wasn't standard procedure for commercial flights arriving in Ouagadougou. Several passengers pointed and murmured questions to one another. Claire noticed the unusual activity too. Her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion as she peered out the windows during her landing preparations. The French CEO, absorbed in his phone, remained oblivious to the changing situation outside. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway, taxiing toward the terminal with the usual series of bumps and turns. As they approached the gate, the full extent of the unusual welcome became clear. A line of official vehicles had formed along the tarmac. Men in military uniforms stood at attention beside the vehicles. This wasn't the typical arrival scene for a commercial flight. As the aircraft came to a complete stop, The atmosphere in the cabin changed. Passengers who had been gathering their belongings paused, sensing something significant was happening. The captain made an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have special arrival procedures today. Please remain seated until further instructions." Claire's professional mask slipped as confusion spread across her face. She approached the cockpit for clarification, returning moments later with wide eyes. The plane door opened, and instead of the usual ground crew, uniformed officers boarded the aircraft. They moved with purpose directly to where President Traore sat. The officer in a black beret came to attention and saluted. "Moura President, welcome home." His respectful greeting echoed through the suddenly silent cabin. Dupont's mouth fell open in shock. "President?" he stammered, the color draining from his face as realization dawned. Claire's hands began to tremble as the implications of her earlier behavior became clear. She had been dismissive and discriminatory toward the President of Burkina Faso himself. The other flight attendants froze in place, unsure how to proceed. Another officer approached Claire and the French CEO. "You two will come with us," he stated firmly. "Wait, what? Why me?" Claire's voice cracked with sudden fear. "You are being detained for questioning. You have publicly disrespected the head of state on national soil. That is a serious offense," the officer explained. President Traore stood calmly, straightening his simple suit jacket. The transformation was subtle but remarkable. Without changing his clothing or raising his voice, his presence now commanded the entire aircraft. The same man who had been deemed unimportant enough to displace was now revealed as the most powerful person on the plane. The other passengers watched in stunned silence as the president walked calmly toward the exit, followed by his security detail. The French CEO and flight attendant were escorted off after him, their former confidence replaced by visible dread. The consequences of their discrimination had arrived with unexpected swiftness. The consequences for Claire and the French CEO came quickly. Authorities detained both for questioning, with potential charges of public insult and discrimination against a head of state. Such offenses carry serious penalties under Burkina Faso law. The French embassy attempted to intervene, but President Traore stood firm. "In Burkina Faso, we don't look at a man's skin to measure his worth. We don't bow to money or to old colonial habits. Here we respect dignity, humanity, and our people. That is the new Africa," Traore stated. This incident serves as a powerful reminder that true dignity isn't determined by status, and justice arrives in unexpected ways.